So, we all think we know the story of Noah, right? The righteous man, the guy who built the ark, the one who saved all of humanity. But what happens after the flood is one of the weirdest and most uncomfortable parts of the whole story. Noah plants a vineyard, gets completely drunk, and is found passed out. How on earth do we square that with the hero we just read about? Well, let's dive into a perspective that reframes this entire event not as a story of sin, but as one of trauma and survival.
And this is the central problem, isn't it? On one hand, you have a man literally chosen by God for being so good. And on the other, you have this scene of what looks like a really shameful drunken moment. Now, the traditional view is that this was Noah's big fall from grace, his one huge mistake. But what if there's another way to look at this? What if what we're seeing isn't sin, but just profound, unimaginable pain?
All right, so let's start by kind of tearing down that common interpretation. Was this really just Noah having a weak moment, making a foolish mistake? To even begin to answer that, we have to remember exactly who we're dealing with here. I mean, the scriptures are incredibly clear about this. Noah isn't just a good guy. He's called righteous, blameless in his generation. It says he walked faithfully with God. Later on, his wisdom is even compared to Daniel's, and his piety is put on the same level as Job's. So the question is, does it really make sense for a man of this spiritual caliber to just mess up this badly? The perspective we're exploring today says probably not. See, to understand Noah's actions, we first have to try and get inside his head. We have to try and wrap our minds around the absolute crushing weight of the trauma he had just been through. Just stop and think about that for a second. This wasn't a war. It wasn't a famine. He was the only adult man who watched every single other person on the entire planet outside his own little family die. He literally witnessed the end of the world.
And these weren't just strangers. At that point in history, everyone was family. These were his uncles, his aunts, his cousins, their kids. Everyone he had ever shared a meal with, everyone he had ever known, was gone. This wasn't some abstract tragedy. It was deeply, deeply personal.
This quote right here, wow. It just paints this vivid picture of a man suffering from what we would today call severe PTSD. This was not a happy survivor. This was a man who was utterly broken by what he saw, haunted by the memories of the world that was washed away.
And this brings us to his state of mind. You know, the very first thing he does when he sets foot on dry land, it wasn't to build a house or throw a party. It was to build an altar. And the type of offering he made is the key to this whole reinterpretation.
He didn't make a simple thank you offering. The source we're looking at identifies it as a Mel Bali, which is a reconciliation offering. This was the act of a terrified, grieving man basically begging God, please reconcile with us, make peace, promise me you will never do this again. It was an offering that came from desperation, not from joy. And this fits perfectly with Scripture, doesn't it? The most powerful offerings aren't the biggest ones, but the ones that come from a broken and contrite heart. And Noah was completely shattered. His offering was so powerful because it came from the deepest part of his pain. It's right after this that God makes his covenant and puts the rainbow in the sky. So, that brings us to the vineyard. If Noah's first act was this desperate plea from a place of deep trauma, what was his second? Well, according to this interpretation, his next move wasn't a sin at all. It was an attempt to heal. Let's just ask the question straight up. This is a man who planned ahead on a massive scale. He built the ark. He was a farmer. He knew what he was doing when he planted a vineyard. He knew what wine was for. So why would this wise, long-term thinker intentionally do something that would lead to his own disgrace? Unless that wasn't the point at all. And this is where the whole interpretation really clicks. There's this verse in Proverbs, and it prescribes wine for a very specific purpose, to help those who are suffering, those with sad hearts, to forget their misery. It wasn't just for parties. It was seen as a kind of medicine for a wounded soul. And there it is. The simplest, most powerful, and most heartbreaking explanation. Noah wasn't looking for a good time. He was looking for a way out. He just wanted, even for a moment, to forget the faces of everyone he lost, to silence the nightmares that were tormenting him.
So this brings us to the central argument. Noah's drunkenness was not an accident. It wasn't a sin.
It was a deliberate, conscious act, a desperate attempt at self-medication for a level of trauma that you and I can't possibly imagine. And in a world without modern medicine, this might have even been an act guided by a spirit that understood his unbearable pain. So when we put all these pieces together, we start to see Noah in a completely different light. Not as a flawed hero, but as a traumatized survivor taking desperate measures just to cope, just to keep going. And think about this. Noah lived to be 950 years old. This wasn't some young guy who didn't know his limits with alcohol. This was a man with centuries of wisdom behind him. His actions were almost certainly intentional. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew why he had to do it. So really, it all comes down to this. The common view sees a righteous man's shameful fall from grace, but this other view, the one from our source, sees something completely different. It sees a righteous man's desperate act of survival, using the only medicine he had to endure a pain that would have destroyed anyone else. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. How we interpret Noah's story really says a lot about us. When we look at these broken figures in these ancient texts, what's our first instinct? Is it to jump to judgment and look for their sin? Or is it to search for their pain and try to find the humanity in their struggle? It's a question worth thinking about.